August 15, 1945, the moment Japan announced its surrender, 563 American warships became instantly worthless. These destroyer escorts, each measuring over 300 feet long and costing $6 million to build, had been constructed for one single purpose: hunting enemy submarines. Now, with no submarines left to hunt, the United States Navy faced an impossible question that had never been asked before in human history. What do you do with the largest fleet of identical warships ever assembled by any nation on Earth, when overnight, every single one of them becomes completely obsolete? The answer would involve scrapping, selling, converting, and abandoning these mighty vessels in ways that seem almost criminal today. And of those 563 ships, only one would survive to tell the story of what really happened. The Destroyer Escort program had emerged from desperation. During the darkest days of 1942, German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. The Battle of the Atlantic hung in the balance, and traditional fleet destroyers were too expensive, too complex, and too slow to produce for convoy protection duties. American naval planners needed a solution, and they needed it immediately. The answer came in the form of a smaller, simpler warship designated the Destroyer Escort. These vessels would be stripped-down submarine hunters, equipped with depth charges, hedgehog mortars, and increasingly sophisticated sonar systems. They would lack the speed and firepower of fleet destroyers, but they could be manufactured using diesel engines and turboelectric propulsion systems that did not compete with the steam turbines required for larger combatants. Most importantly, they could be built fast. American shipyards responded with an industrial effort that remains astonishing to comprehend. Facilities from coast to coast began laying keels for destroyer escorts, employing prefabrication techniques borrowed from commercial shipbuilding. Sections were assembled in factories miles from water, transported by rail, and welded together at coastal yards. Some destroyer escorts went from initial steel cutting to commissioned warship in under 6 months. The production rate accelerated throughout 1943 and 1944 until vessels were entering service at a pace of nearly 2 per week. By the time victory arrived, these ships had proven their worth beyond any reasonable doubt. Destroyer escorts operating in the Atlantic had sent 67 German submarines to the ocean floor. In the Pacific, they had screened invasion fleets, rescued downed aviators, and provided anti-submarine coverage across thousands of miles of contested waters. The crews who served aboard them, averaging 186 men per vessel, had developed tactics and techniques that transformed convoy protection. From desperate gamble to reliable science, the destroyer escort had done exactly what it was designed to do. But success created its own problem. Victory meant the immediate elimination of the threat these ships existed to counter. German U-boats had either been destroyed, captured, or scuttled by their crews. Japanese submarines, never as effective as their German counterparts, had been virtually eliminated from the Pacific. The massive fleet that had won the Battle of the Atlantic was suddenly a massive liability, consuming fuel, requiring maintenance, and occupying valuable berths at naval facilities across the globe. The financial mathematics were brutal. Each destroyer escort required approximately $150,000 annually, simply to maintain in reserve status. Keeping the entire fleet operational would consume over $800 million every year. An impossible sum when Congress was demanding immediate demobilization and slashing military budgets by 3/4. The men who crewed these ships wanted to go home. The factories that built them needed to return to civilian production. The war was over, and everything had to change. The Navy's Bureau of Ships convened panels of experts to determine each vessel's fate. The fleet was not uniform despite its apparent standardization. 6 distinct classes of destroyer escorts existed, each with different propulsion systems and capabilities. The Everts class, numbering 97 ships, used diesel-electric drives. The Buckley class, with 154 examples, employed turbo-electric propulsion and carried improved anti-submarine armament. The Cannon class returned to diesel-electric power with different reduction gearing. The Escort class comprised 85 diesel-powered vessels. The Rudero class represented an improved Buckley design with 72 ships. Finally, the John C. Butler class, the most capable of all, used conventional steam turbines and numbered 83 examples. This diversity complicated every decision, maintaining spare parts inventories and trained technicians for 6 different propulsion systems would multiply costs exponentially. Logic demanded standardization, which meant most classes would face elimination regardless of their individual condition. All remaining service life. By December 1945, the broad outlines of the disposal plan had emerged. Approximately 100 destroyer escorts would continue active service, patrolling both oceans and maintaining American naval presence worldwide. Another 200 vessels would enter the reserve fleet, carefully preserved and maintained for potential future reactivation. The remaining 263 ships would be disposed of through various means, scrapped for their metal content, sold to allied nations rebuilding their navies, or converted for specialized purposes that might justify their continued existence. The active fleet selection prioritized the newest and most capable vessels. John C. Butler class and late production Rudero class ships received preference due to their superior speed and more modern systems. By mid-1946, 87 destroyer escorts remained in commission, primarily assigned to Atlantic Fleet anti-submarine warfare squadrons. These vessels continued conducting patrols, training exercises, and diplomatic port visits, though their crews now consisted of volunteers rather than wartime conscripts. The reserve fleet program absorbed 203 destroyer escorts between 1946 and 1948. The preservation process employed at facilities in Norfolk, Charleston, Orange, and San Diego was remarkably thorough. Every piece of machinery was drained, cleaned, and coated with protective compounds. Electronics were removed and stored in climate-controlled warehouses. Weapons were preserved with specialized greases and covered against the elements. Hulls received fresh paint and regular inspections. The goal was maintaining each vessel in condition, allowing reactivation within 90 days. This mothball fleet represented a calculated gamble. The Cold War was already emerging, and Soviet submarine construction showed no signs of slowing. American planners understood that the submarine threat had not vanished, but merely changed nationality. Preserving 200 destroyer escorts cost far less than building new vessels if anti-submarine forces were suddenly needed again. The expense of storage seemed justified against the expense of starting from scratch. Scrapping claimed the largest number of surplus vessels. 147 destroyer escorts were sold to commercial shipbreakers. Between 1946 and 1948, facilities in New Jersey, Texas, and California systematically dismantled ships that had been fighting German submarines just months earlier. Each vessel yielded approximately 800 tons of steel, 15 tons of copper, and smaller quantities of brass, aluminum, and other valuable metals. The post-war American economy desperately needed raw materials, and the destroyer escorts provided them. The scrapping process was efficient but final. Ships with less than 2 years of actual service were reduced to raw materials. Within weeks of arriving at breakers' yards, workers who had never seen combat cut apart vessels that had depth-charged U-boats, rescued torpedoed sailors, and crossed both oceans multiple times. Nothing remained of these ships except their logbooks, photographs, and the memories of men who had served aboard them. Foreign military sales provided an alternative fate for 79 destroyer escorts. This program accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It disposed of surplus tonnage, strengthened Allied naval capabilities, and extended American influence over post-war maritime affairs. France received 13 vessels under the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, using them to rebuild naval forces devastated by German occupation. The Netherlands acquired 8 ships, redesignating them as frigates for colonial operations in the East Indies. Brazil obtained 7 destroyer escorts that became the foundation of its anti-submarine capability. Italy, Greece, Uruguay, and other nations received smaller allocations. The most politically significant transfers went to Japan. Between 1953 and 1956, 18 destroyer escorts crossed the Pacific to become the foundation of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, established under the 1951 Security Treaty. These vessels were redesignated as patrol frigates to comply with Japan's post-war constitution, prohibiting offensive military forces. Japanese crews received extensive training at American facilities before assuming control of their new ships. The transfers provoked controversy, as they involved arming a recently defeated enemy. But strategic considerations prevailed. Japan's geographic position made it essential for containing Soviet Pacific ambitions, and a capable Japanese naval force served American interests. Conversion programs transformed 47 destroyer escorts into specialized vessels serving entirely new purposes. The most significant conversions created radar picket escorts designated DER. These ships received enhanced radar systems, expanded communications equipment, and distinctive tall antenna masts. 26 destroyer escorts underwent this transformation between 1949 and 1952, emerging configured for early warning duties rather than submarine hunting. The conversions reflected changing threat perceptions, as aircraft and guided missiles joined submarines in the catalog of dangers facing American naval forces. 12 destroyer escorts became high-speed transports, designated APD. This conversion removed some armament while installing accommodations for 162 troops and additional landing craft davits. The resulting vessels could deliver special forces and raiders at speeds exceeding 20 knots. APD conversions proved their value during the occupation of Japan, and later during amphibious operations in Korea. 5 destroyer escorts underwent conversion to experimental platforms. The USS Fist became a sonar test ship at the Naval Underwater Sound Laboratory. The USS Eugene Elmore tested new electronic warfare systems. These experimental vessels contributed significantly to Cold War technological development even as they departed from their original combat role. The Korean War transformed everything. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, the Navy suddenly needed every available escort vessel for convoy protection, amphibious support, and blockade enforcement. Between July 1950 and December 1951, 39 destroyer escorts emerged from mothballs and returned to active service. The preservation procedures proved their worth, as most vessels achieved operational status within the planned 90-day timeframe. The recommissioned destroyer escorts operated primarily in Pacific waters, escorting supply convoys, providing naval gunfire support during amphibious landings, and conducting coastal patrols. Their performance validated both the reserve fleet concept and the original destroyer escort design. However, limitations became apparent. These ships were slower than modern destroyers. Their anti-aircraft armament was inadequate against jet aircraft, and their habitability fell short of peacetime standards that crews now expected. The post-Korea period brought continued reduction. Between 1953 and 1957, 73 additional destroyer escorts were sold for scrap as the Navy adjusted its force structure. The reserve fleet shrank as some vessels deteriorated beyond economical repair after years of storage. By 1960, only 62 destroyer escorts remained in active American service, with 94 more in reserve. Though many reserve vessels were considered unlikely reactivation candidates due to age and obsolete systems, Soviet submarine advances prompted one final modernization effort. The Fleet Rehabilitation and Modernization Program, known as FRAM, selected 35 destroyer escorts for comprehensive upgrades. These vessels received updated sonar, improved anti-submarine weapons including the new ASROC rocket system, and enhanced communications. The conversions occurred between 1960 and 1962 at shipyards in Charleston, Long Beach, and Philadelphia. FRAM modernized destroyer escorts gained roughly another decade of useful service. The final American destroyer escort decommissionings occurred between 1972 and 1974. These last vessels, PRIMARILY FRAM modified John C. Butler and Ruddero-class ships, departed active service with minimal ceremony. The Navy had already transitioned to newer frigate designs incorporating gas turbines, guided missiles, and helicopter facilities. Technology had finally rendered further destroyer escort modification pointless. Foreign service extended destroyer escort careers far beyond American retirement. French ships remained operational until 1976. Netherlands vessels served until 1967. Brazilian examples continued into 1989. The longest service belonged to destroyer escorts, transferred to the Republic of China. Some Taiwanese vessels remained operational until 1999, meaning ships built in 1943 and 1940 served for over 50 years, defending a nation that did not exist when their keels were laid. Preservation efforts proved remarkably limited. Of 563 destroyer escorts constructed precisely to survive today, the USS Slater, a Cannon-class vessel, rests in Albany, New York after serving with the Greek Navy from 1951 to 1991. American preservationists reacquired the ship in 1993, towing it across the Atlantic and restoring it to wartime configuration. The USS Stuart, an Escort-class destroyer escort, served as a museum ship in Galveston, Texas from 1946 until deterioration forced its scrapping in 1971. The Stuart had uniquely served Japan as Patrol Boat 102 after capture in 1942, returning to American control only after Japan's surrender. This preservation rate of less than 0.2% reflects harsh realities. Destroyer escorts lacked the glamour of battleships or aircraft carriers. Their relatively small size made museum conversion difficult. By the time preservation awareness emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, most examples had already been scrapped or transferred abroad. The workhorses of the fleet rarely received the recognition accorded to its champions. The technological legacy of the destroyer escort program influenced American naval design for decades. Mass production techniques pioneered during deconstruction informed post-war shipbuilding practices. Equipment standardization demonstrated the value of commonality in fleet logistics. The destroyer escort's size and capabilities established parameters that shaped subsequent frigate classes, particularly the Knox class of the 1960s and Oliver Hazard Perry class of the 1970s. Anti-submarine warfare tactics developed aboard destroyer escorts during combat operations formed the foundation of Cold War ASW doctrine. Hedgehog mortars, pattern depth charges, and increasingly sophisticated sonar systems all matured in destroyer escort service. The operational experience gained by thousands of sailors created an institutional knowledge base that proved invaluable as the Navy confronted Soviet submarine expansion. Standing before the USS Slater today, one confronts the mathematics of destruction. 563 vessels reduced to a single survivor represents a loss rate of 99.8%. This near-total elimination occurred not through combat, which claimed relatively few destroyer escorts, but through the mundane economics of peacetime defense budgets and relentless technological obsolescence. Ships that cost millions to build and required thousands of men to operate were reduced to their scrap value within 2 decades. The destroyer escorts that hunted U-boats across the Atlantic and screened convoys through the Pacific became more expensive to maintain than they were worth to keep. Their story demonstrates how quickly military technology transitions from critical to obsolete, how rapidly the instruments of victory become the burdens of peace. 563 warships reduced to one, standing as sole witness to an industrial achievement and military contribution that reshaped the oceans of the world.